On the humid, stormy afternoon of July 12, 1946, Langston Hughes sat in an apartment on East 52nd Street in Manhattan with playwright Elmer Rice and composer Kurt Weill working on the lyrics for Street Scene. They'd spent much of the meeting arguing about a single song, in fact, about a single word. "I guess there must be something I don't comprehend," ran the words to Lonely House in the middle of Act 1. "Cockroaches have companions, even stray dogs find a friend." "No," Rice erupted. "In a lyrical song like that, cockroaches, no." And eventually, after deliberating, Rice prevailed, and Hughes substituted sparrows for cockroaches, thereby setting the text that still appears in the score today. But not everybody was happy about this switch. As they were leaving, Weill leaned over to Hughes and muttered, "This will never be another three-penny opera. Brecht would have left the cockroaches in." Anybody familiar with Weill's scholarship may find this anecdote surprising. Many critics have argued that Weill abandoned his avant-garde affiliations when he left Germany in 1934. This is known as the two-Weill approach to Weill scholarship. It separates the avant-garde iconoclast in Berlin from the conventional songwriter on Broadway. Theodor Adorno, for example, held this position. As soon as Weill allowed himself to be guided by larger musical forms, he failed. And precisely by harboring the higher aspirations he formerly ridiculed, he fell under the spell of a mere amusement theater, the American musical. However, when Weill praised the cockroaches in the Three-Penny Opera, he seemed to corroborate a different approach to Weill research, the one-Weill approach. This other approach argues that Weill harbored sympathy for Brecht and the avant-garde on both sides of the Atlantic. Yet I argue that this approach also does not quite fit. 10 days earlier, Weill had written to friends back in Germany, "I almost never see Brecht. He is still the old egomaniac and obsessed with his idiotic old theories without any sign of a more human development." So which is it? Did Weill reject Brecht as avant-garde, Brecht did the avant-garde as idiotic? Or did he ally himself with the avant-garde throughout his career, even on Broadway? The answer, I argue, is both. Today, I will sketch a different solution to the two-Weill problem, one that accounts both for Weill's continued sympathy toward the avant-garde and also for what he called his human development. My investigation will be in two parts. First, I will situate Street Scene within a tradition of experimental musicals that opened on Broadway during the late 1930s. Although this genre remains largely unknown to scholars, it is nonetheless important, not least because both Rice and Weill worked on these productions early in their Broadway careers. In the second half of this presentation, I will demonstrate that Weill retained the values of these experimental musicals throughout the 1940s. Evidence for my argument lies in thousands of pages of previously unanalyzed drafts for Street Scene housed in the Langston Hughes collection at Yale University. On these drafts, Hughes kept meticulous notes about his work with Weill and Rice, amounting to a day-by-day or sometimes even hour-by-hour diary of the show's progress. From them emerges a set of theatrical values that are in line with what I call a popular avant-garde. Ultimately, this category of popular avant-garde raises broader historiographical concerns. To many, popular avant-garde may sound like a contradiction of terms. Writers such as Adorno and Clement Greenberg have held that, whatever form the avant-garde may have taken, it stood in some fundamental way opposed to the culture industry and opposed to middlebrow, mass, bourgeois, or pop culture. But I contend that Weill's Broadway shows reveal a competing avant-garde, one that the familiar avant-garde staunchly opposed, and which, because of these thinkers' continued influence in scholarship today, remains largely hidden from view. Weill allied himself with the Berlin avant-garde early in his career when he wrote a weekly column for Die Deutsche Rundfunk and worked closely with Brecht. His theories are complex, and a complete discussion of them lies beyond the scope of this presentation. But at the most fundamental level, Weill opposed what he called romanticism in art because it, quote, precludes thinking, it involves narcotic properties, it shows mankind in an exceptional state, and in its golden age, Wagner, it generally relinquished any representation of mankind. His goal was to create another form of theater, which is beginning to be successful today, which counts on a spectator who follows the proceedings with the quiet composure of a thinking person who, since he really wants to think, perceives any demand on his pleasure centers, Genussnerven, as an annoyance. Put roughly, at this stage in his career, Weill had two essential goals. First, to make art speak directly to his audience's daily lives, and second, to engage spectators primarily as thinkers, not feelers. When Weill arrived in New York, however, he began working in a different kind of experimental theater. His first two projects were sponsored in part by the Federal Theater Project, a branch of Roosevelt's administration that employed out-of-work actors, designers, playwrights, and composers during the Great Depression. The project also sponsored workshops, and these tended to foster experimental political playwriting and composition. Especially important to this group was Hans Eisler, who emigrated to the United States in the 1930s and became a galvanizing force for musicians in New York. Charles Seeger, for example, Charles Seeger also wanted to write an oratorio where Eisler was the hero and the whole chorus would sing a communist choir in praise of Hans Eisler. But Charles Seeger, for example, said that Eisler's aesthetic used ordinary fragments of technique in an unusual way because we thought that was revolutionary and therefore suitable for the workers to use. We didn't give them these patterns in the usual way, which is what Broadway did. Broadway just handed out a certain number of formulas in the usual way, but we took those same formulas, simply used them differently, and hoped that we were doing something revolutionary. Lots of compositions were in that type. They had unusual harmonic progressions in them, but usual chords. Or if there were some unusual chords, they put them in conventional patterns. With these overarching principles in place, the Federal Theater Project found Weill to be a natural fit. The overture to Johnny Johnson, for example, exhibits many of these features. It begins with a brass fanfare, familiar from many Broadway overtures, but inflects it with an unusual level of dissonance. This gives way to a lyrical F major 16-bar period, but then Weill inserts a chromatic substitute in place of the expected dominant. And we'll hear this now. Antecedent phrase. Consequent phrase. Unusual chord is coming up. As Seeger described, familiar Broadway gestures are certainly audible, and the unexpected effects jolt the audience out of their familiar listening habits, creating a style that I call the popular avant-garde. Starting exactly at this time, Weill began to write about the human development of his music, a phrase that he almost always tied to emotion. In 1935, for example, he wrote, "Music can only express human sentiments, and then I write to express human emotions solely." This represents a fundamental change in his approach to the musical. If Weill had regarded his German audiences as thinkers first, feelers second, he engaged his American audience as feelers first, thinkers second. He retained this focus throughout the 1940s. In the earliest planning phases for Street Scene, for example, Weill told Hughes that a central feature of the show was to be its emotion, the power of two love stories, and he suggested La Boheme and Louise as models. In the month before Street Scene opened, Weill told the Musical Digest that when he arrived in America, he noticed that he could play upon the emotions of the theatergoers as on an instrument. However, just because Weill wanted to engage his audience emotionally, he did not abandon his desire to create theater that would make people think critically. In the original liner notes to Street Scene, written shortly after the show opened in 1947, Weill cited theatrical works he considered to be stepping stones in the direction of Street Scene. In each of these previous shows, I tried out certain elements of the musical theater which I was dreaming about. In the Threepenny Opera, which was my first musical play, we deliberately stopped the action during the songs which were written to illustrate the philosophy, the inner meaning of the play. Mahagoni was a dramatic review using elements of the theater from slapstick to opera. Each of these earlier shows featured conspicuous breaks that thwarted the audience from becoming engrossed in the emotional lives of the characters, a far cry, in other words, from Puccini, Charpentier, or so-called integrated Broadway musicals, musicals in which scripts, sets, and score all work together to tell a single story. With Street Scene, Weill's goal was to square a theatrical circle, to write an emotionally engrossing, integrated Broadway musical that would also be able to retain elements of the political, avant-garde, unintegrated theater of Brecht. This may seem straightforward in theory, but it was very difficult in execution, and no scene proved more difficult to write than the graduation sequence in the middle of the first act. Langston Hughes remembered that it took longer to write this song than the entire second act of the play. He was wrong about that. It took longer to write this one song than the entire rest of the show. During the early phases of planning, this song was called not the graduation scene, but rather the melting pot scene. In it, the main character was slated to sing a song that would deliver the show's central political message. On December 14th, 1945, Hughes wrote a draft of this song called Where Each Man is a Friend. If only life and art could merge to lift humanity, in art and art alone can man escape reality. Burst of beautiful and sensuous music. Music can open a gate to a road of delight without end. Poetry can show the way to a land where each man is a friend. The philosophy, as it gradually coalesced, involved the benefits of mutual understanding amid diversity, and in this version, music vouchsafed a vision of that utopic society. The team had doubts with both the message and the form of this song. At the top of the draft, Hughes scribbled discard and too abstract, a critique that would become common during the rest of the show's development. They feared that the song's delivery seemed unnatural, unintegrated, pontificating an abstract message at the audience. The goal was to tie the political message of diversity more directly into the action of the show, to integrate the two, and to do so in concrete terms, not abstract terms about romantic aesthetic beauty. So, in January 1946, the team changed course. Weill wrote to Hughes, "The melting pot scene we have worked out somewhat along the following line. It should start out with a funny description of Columbus's trip by Lippo, always at the end of the stanza interrupted by Olson's dry remark, but Erickson was first. Then we'll have a number of rather short songs for the different nationalities built on the refrain, if it weren't for the Irish, the Germans, the Negroes, etc., where would America be? This would lead to a short fight. Then we decided Sam should come in and give them the melting pot idea, and this leads to a big ensemble." Hughes went to work on this scene, attempting to articulate the show's central political message, the melting pot idea, through a large ensemble number rather than through a solo. By late April or May 1946, Weill sketched his first music for this scene, which he now called A Nation of Nations. For this song, he devised a form that would provide a musical analog to the text's political ideas. The piece was in a popular verse-refrain form. Each verse was in a different recognizable national style, an Irish jig, African-American jazz. But each refrain coalesced into a single melody shared by everybody, a musical e pluribus unum. In this case, we see two German characters telling the rest of the crowd that the American nation would starve of starvation without schnitzels, hamburgers, and hot dogs. And then they launch into the cut time refrain. So if it weren't for the Germans, German folk like me, then please somebody tell me where would America be? Despite all the changes to this scene that would follow in the next 5 months, this verse-chorus form would remain more or less intact. But there were still problems. The scene seemed to come out of nowhere. Over the summer of 1946, Weill, Hughes, and Rice tried to find solutions, none of which they found successful. Finally, on October 5th, 1946, while they were in rehearsal basically, the team devised a new strategy. In his notes, Hughes wrote in large letters across the center of the page, "Love is the thing," and at the bottom, when I, if. The idea was that rather than stating a philosophy outright, the characters on stage would describe their goals in life, realizing that working together across ethnic boundaries could help them realize their dreams. A scene that did not explicitly describe the Nation of Nations political philosophy, but enacted it instead. The next day, Hughes wrote a letter to Weill to describe the new song for this scene. The lyric, "that happy feeling," or if we wish to double up the word happy, "that happy, happy feeling," has the advantage of lending itself to great lyrical variety within the framework of its form. Since it is a 32-bar, two-part chorus, with a little release of 2 lines in each half, the release may be continually varied. If laughs are desired, it may be gagged up to suit each character. And only one half of the chorus needs to be repeated by the ensemble each time after each character sings. Musically, the new form of the song represents a change from previous months. Instead of featuring a complex set of interlocking verses and refrains, this version had no verse and only one repeating refrain altered for each nationality, with alternating lines for soloist and ensemble. The song, in other words, became more conventional, simpler, more explicitly in line with typical Broadway two-part choruses, otherwise known as the A-B-A-C format, in which B was what Hughes called a release or bridge, and C the recurring couplet. But how would they motivate this moment naturally? At this point, the team devised a scenario that remains in the final version of the show. The action on stage would be interrupted by a group of students returning from their high school graduation, and in the spirit of looking toward the future, everybody on stage would articulate as concretely as possible what he or she wanted out of life. This song eventually became Wrapped in a Ribbon and Tied in a Bow. The character Jones wanted 100 to 1 hot mazuma, which is slang for money, wrapped in a ribbon, tied in a bow. Lippo wanted a bambino, wrapped in a ribbon and tied with a bow. Musically, the general format remained the same, except Weill instructed Hughes to write a single, repeating 32-bar refrain with the title in the 4th, 8th, and 16th line, this time with a single release that goes off. In other words, converting the A-B-A-C form to an A-A-B-A form. We will now hear this song with its aspirational lyrics and repeating chorus form. The A section.
Don't think of unhappy tomorrow. A brighter day's coming, I know. And I'm sure you will find for good fortune.
The next A section.
I'll bet Jenny'll find a rich husband.
Oh, please, Mr. Fiorentino.
B section.
In the year you'll be here, she's knitting little pink boots. And one happy day your granddaughter will say, "Oh, please, grandmama, let's go ride the shoots. And then you'll
A
have
section.
Mary and Charlie. Just think of how far they can go. We'll buy mama a car and a castle.
Missing from this version was any allusion to ethnic style. Weill scrubbed the song of Irish jigs, German waltzes, Italian tarantellas, or African-American boogie-woogie. Instead, the song was written in a kind of personal, a general popular style that many described as reminiscent of Rodgers and Hammerstein. Missing, too, was any explicit political message. Instead, the scene was generally optimistic about the ways in which the mix of races and cultures in America could produce a more fulfilling and productive country. once the show shed its overt partisan references, how could the team be sure that the audience would interpret it in political terms? For this, Weill and his colleagues turned explicitly to the press. A few days before the production opened, Weill held an interview with a newspaper with the explicit intention of influencing the critical response to the show. First, Weill described the show's form as somehow more than the typical musical comedy. Each show of this type has to create its own style, its own texture, its own relationship between words and music, because music becomes a truly integral part of the play. It helps deepen the emotions and clarify the structure. The purpose of this was to encourage the audience to receive the show not as mere entertainment, but rather as serious art meant to be analyzed. Second, Weill encouraged the audience to think of the music's style in political terms. As soon as I began to think about the music for Street Scene, I discovered that the play lent itself to a great variety of music, just as the streets of New York themselves embraced the music of many lands and people. This strategy worked, and almost all reviewers asserted their sympathy with the nation's destitute, a politically charged issue on the heels of the Depression and the New Deal. And they did so in overwhelmingly emotional terms. For example, producer Billy Rose, who's kind of like a Trumpist figure of the 1940s, had initially declined to invest in Street Scene out of fear that it would be boring. But he saw it on Broadway and wept. Once the curtain flew, he recalled looking at a world of trapped and hungering people who reach out for something pretty and got their fingers stepped on. Olin Downs mentioned Wrapped in a Ribbon and Tied with a Bow, and wrote in the New York Times that he listened to the charming music and to Mr. Hughes's simple and moving lines, and looked on the squalor and humanity of all with a lump in his throat. If Weill's goals were to produce a musical that would be experimental in form, relevant in its political message, and emotional in its effect, he succeeded. And he did so in terms that were different from Brecht's idiotic theories, but were nonetheless in line with his own human development in New York's popular avant-garde. But even if we acknowledge that Street Scene is innovative, does this make it specifically avant-garde? According to scholars such as Peter Burger and Andres Huyssen, the hallmark of the avant-garde movements in the early years of the 20th century was not just their seriousness or experimental style. Rather, all avant-garde movements rejected bourgeois institutions that cordoned off art into a sphere that was autonomous from everyday life, either through aesthetics, through adhering to traditional canons of beauty, or by existing as mere entertainment confined to leisure time. The primary goal of avant-garde art, these scholars maintain, was to integrate art into life again. On this account, Street Scene seems avant-garde indeed, by producing a show that ran the gamut from opera to Broadway in divergent yet recognizable styles. Weill aimed to produce strong, immediate emotional responses that he would mobilize toward contemporary political ends, thereby integrating the show into daily life. But does it sound avant-garde? Probably not, at least to today's audiences. But as historian Joachim Schulte-Sase has noted, writers such as Theodor Adorno and Clement Greenberg produced an additional mandate for the avant-garde. In order to sound avant-garde, Adorno argued, one must also reject convention. Because popular culture traded in familiar styles, it must be mere amusement, offering no possibility for thoughtful critique or reflection. But Weill did not accept this premise, and neither, I argue, must we. Instead of rejecting convention, Weill mobilized the shared connotations of different styles, opera, boogie-woogie, ethnic music, and so on, toward political ends. In other words, rather than reject convention, as Adorno said, he used convention unconventionally. Thereby, he achieved avant-garde ends, creating emotional and political immediacy in order to reintegrate art into everyday life and to undermine bourgeois or romantic artistic institutions. So returning to our opening two-Weill question, both sides of the debate have typically relied on the same preconditions for the avant-garde, that it stands in opposition to shared or popular culture. But I argue that Weill's Broadway musicals achieved avant-garde ends in ways that no longer seem avant-garde today, inviting us as historians to analyze our historiographical understanding about what constitutes the avant-garde. If we recognize the possibility of a popular avant-garde, then we also recognize a group of writers and composers who have long remained at the fringes of scholarship: Charles Seeger, Paul Rosenfeld, Paul Green, Archibald MacLeish, and Van Wyck Brooks. Like Weill, they all had avant-garde goals, but they achieved them through popular ends. This group, I argue, constitutes not just a popular avant-garde, but also a hidden avant-garde. It is now time to uncover it. Thank you.